So today, we're going to talk about the blueprint of life itself. We're going to uncover how the instructions for who we are get passed down from one generation to the next, solving a mystery that people have wondered about for, well, forever. All right, let's get into it.
You know, it's a question we've all asked ourselves at some point. Maybe you've got your mom's eyes or your dad's nose. That family resemblance is something we all experience, a visible link to our past. It's really the most obvious sign of this whole process we call inheritance.
But here's the thing. You're not an exact copy, are you? While you definitely share traits with your family, you are completely, uniquely you. So that kind of begs the question, right? If you're getting your instructions from the same people, why all the differences? And that's where the real mystery begins.
So this mix of being so similar yet so different, that's the heart of the family resemblance puzzle. It's a puzzle that really has two main pieces: inheritance, which is the stuff that gets passed down, and variation, which is the reason we're all unique. Let's start by tackling that first piece of the puzzle.
At its most basic, inheritance is just the process of passing traits from parents to their kids. I mean, think about things like your height, your hair color, even your blood type. None of that is random. They're all inherited instructions. But for most of history, nobody had a clue how this transfer actually worked. All right, to really crack this case, we gotta hop in a time machine and travel back to the 19th century. We need to meet the lead detective on the case, an Austrian monk named Gregor Mendel. Working from a humble monastery garden, he would become the guy who uncovered the fundamental laws of genetics.
Now, Mendel didn't jump right into studying something as complicated as people. Nope. His key witness, if you will, was the humble pea plant. And this choice, which might seem kind of random, was actually a stroke of genius. The pea plant was the perfect tool for his investigation.
So you might be asking, why pea plants? What was so special about them? Well, for one, they grow super fast, which let Mendel study a bunch of generations in a really short amount of time. They also had these very clear either-or traits. A plant was either tall or it was dwarf, no in between. And crucially, he could control who they pollinated with, basically playing matchmaker to see what would happen.
Okay, so with his trusty pea plants, Mendel set up these absolutely brilliant experiments to finally crack the code. And the one we're going to look at, the big one, is called the monohybrid cross. It gives us a crystal clear window into how these traits get passed down.
And what's so cool is how simple the setup was. First, he took a pure breeding tall plant and crossed it with a pure breeding dwarf plant. That was his parent, or pea, generation. Then he planted those seeds and watched the first generation of kids, the F1 generation, grow. And finally, he let those F1 plants cross with each other to produce a second generation, the F2s.
And right away, something totally unexpected happened. You'd think you'd get some tall, some short, maybe even some medium plants, right? But that's not what he saw. Every single plant in that first generation was tall. It was like the dwarf trait had just vanished into thin air. So the big question was, where did it go?
But when Mendel let those tall F1 plants cross, the mystery started to unravel. The dwarf trait came back. This little grid here, it's called a Punnett square, and it shows us exactly what's going on. Each of those F1 parent plants was carrying both a tall factor, a big T, and a hidden dwarf factor, a little t. This grid shows all the possible ways they could combine. And look, right there in that bottom corner, you see TT, that's our little dwarf plant making its return.
So Mendel, being the good scientist he was, counted everything. And he found this incredible pattern. It turned out that for every one dwarf plant, there were 3 tall ones, a perfect 3-to-1 ratio. This was a massive clue, a mathematical hint that there were hidden rules at play. And what he could actually see, the tallness or dwarfness, that's what we now call the phenotype.
But here's the really mind-blowing part. Underneath that 3-to-1 ratio of what you could see, there was a hidden ratio. For every one pure tall plant, the TT, there were 2 hybrid tall plants, the TTs, and 1 pure dwarf plant, the little t's. This 1-to-2-to-1 mix, this is the genotype, the actual genetic code. And that right there was the key that unlocked everything. So from all this careful work, Mendel came up with a set of rules, or principles, that we now call the laws of inheritance. And honestly, these laws are the foundation for everything we know about genetics today.
Okay, so law number 1. The law of dominance. This is the why behind all those first-generation plants being tall. Basically, the tallness trait is dominant, which means it just overpowers or masks the recessive dwarf trait. The dwarf trait was still there the whole time, it was just hiding.
And that brings us to law number 2, the law of segregation. This one explains how that dwarf trait managed to make a comeback. What Mendel figured out is that for every trait, you've got two factors, or genes, but you only pass on one of them to your kids. They separate or segregate from each other. This ensures that traits are passed on as neat, individual units, not all blended together like paint.
Now remember, Mendel was doing all this back in the 1860s. It was absolutely groundbreaking. But you might be wondering, how does this old-school pea plant science apply to us? Well, it turns out the rules he found in that little garden are pretty much universal. They govern inheritance in everything, including us. It actually took decades, but eventually, scientists found these things inside our cells called chromosomes, and this is where it all clicked. The chromosomal theory of inheritance finally showed that Mendel's abstract factors were actually real things. We call them genes, sitting at specific spots on these chromosomes.
A really simple way to see this in action is how sex is determined in humans. So females have two X chromosomes, XX. Males have one X and one Y, XY. Since a mom can only give an X chromosome, it's the dad's contribution, whether he passes on an X or a Y, that determines the baby's sex. A perfect real-world example.
And this is where it gets really, really important. Because understanding these basic rules is absolutely crucial for understanding, diagnosing, and hopefully, one day, treating all sorts of genetic disorders. Everything from conditions like sickle cell anemia all the way to chromosomal disorders like Down syndrome.
So we started with a simple question, right? Why do I look like my parents? And that question took us on this incredible journey, from a quiet monastery garden all the way to the very blueprint for life itself. Gregor Mendel gave us that blueprint. The big question for our generation is, what are we going to build with it?